LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. I've got 36 really good clips on the topics you can see listed down in the video description, and if you're watching this as a recorded show more than 12 hours after broadcast, you should see time indexes down there to skip to the topics that interest you, starting with the ISIS-Islam topic, then one clip on the school shooting in Washington state this last week, then about 20 clips on the continuing breaking news about Ebola, including the first interview with the healthcare worker who's been confined in this new quarantine imposed in New Jersey, New York, and a couple other states, and finally, I'll have several clips on politics, a couple on the midterm elections that are coming up on November 4th, and then a few more on presidential politics, discussing President Obama's legacy and some Republicans who are looking to replace him in 2016. As always, I've picked out the best clips from the Sunday morning news analysis shows from the corporate media here in the United States, along with my commentary between the clips, and along with some of those quasi-news political comedy clips I like to add to the mix. This week, both from HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher from last Friday and also last night's Saturday Night Live. All the other clips come from those Sunday morning news analysis shows on the regular Big Five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News. But as usual, I want to start out with a comedy clip, though it's kind of dark comedy, from Bill Maher's monologue last Friday, talking about the recent so-called lone wolf attacks by Muslims in Canada. Over in this clip.
No, it's Canadian terrorism. There was, I'm sure you saw this, an attack on the Canadian Parliament. The shooter, we know now, was a convert to, well, I don't want to be called a bigot, so I'll just say a religion. I don't know which one. That's how much of a liberal I am, because it's equally likely it could be any religion. You know what? I think it was the Amish. I think the guy was Amish. No, he was a guy who was he's a jihadist, a Muslim jihadist, and a Canadian jihadist. Wow. The authorities are calling him Vanilla ISIS.
So Bill Maher's joking there is kind of dark, like I said, though I guess that part about Vanilla ISIS wasn't as funny as his feigned ignorance about what religion these lone wolf attackers come from, and I'll have a couple more clips from Bill Maher in a few minutes discussing the topic of Islam a little more with Dr. Cornel West in the panel discussion. But first I wanted to get some news clips about these lone wolf attacks and the lone wolf attacks weren't just in Canada, but there was also this recent hatchet attack against some police officers in New York that was caught on video, and ABC reporter Dianne Harris used that video to start his report on lone wolf attacks on ABC this week, This Week with George Stephanopoulos this morning, over in this clip.
It took only 7 seconds, but it was devastating. A hatchet attack by this man against 4 New York City police officers, one of them hit in the head before the suspect was shot and killed. Zale Thompson, a 32-year-old unemployed recent Muslim convert who police say was self-radicalized on the internet watching videos of ISIS and Al-Qaeda.
I'm very comfortable this was a terrorist attack, certainly.
It came just a day after that deadly rampage in the Canadian capital when another 32-year-old Muslim convert put the city of Ottawa on lockdown. After allegedly killing a soldier who was guarding Canada's National War Memorial, Michael Zahaf-Bibeau stormed the Parliament building as bystanders fled.
Shots were fired, and that's when the gunman started running, again with bullets flying at him, directly down this hallway. This is the incredible part. He then ran past these 2 rooms, which were filled with members of Parliament. And in fact, in this room was the Prime Minister himself.
He was stopped by Sergeant-at-Arms Kevin Vickers, seen here just moments after he shot and killed the suspect. Zahaf-Bibeau, unemployed with a long criminal record, was reportedly frustrated over delays in getting a passport to travel to the Middle East. The attack part of a worrying worldwide trend. After ISIS put out an online call for attacks against Western targets, homegrown extremists have been either killed during their attacks or arrested beforehand in America, Canada, England, and Australia.
Terror is theater. And obviously, they're trying to create and instill fear. And unfortunately, I think we're going to see more of it.
For this week, Dan Harris, ABC News.
So those are the breaking lone wolf stories from this last week, which has led to some Republicans to call for greater surveillance of Muslims, like New York Congressman Peter King, who I think probably qualifies pretty easily for the label Islamophobic, at least given his repeated delusion about Al-Qaeda planning to attack Fort Knox that I refuted in previous LiberalViewer Sunday Live clip roundups, and I also made an excerpt video about that. And Peter King was apparently too Islamophobic even for his fellow Republican and House Homeland Security Chair Mike McCall, as you can see when ABC host Martha Raddatz asked Mike McCall about Peter King's comments regarding how Muslims need to be under surveillance over in this clip.
Attack like this.
And Congressman McCall, your colleague, Congressman Peter King, said this week, we need to be more closely watching Muslim communities in the U.S. and go all out with surveillance and be quick to call it terrorism. Do you agree with him that these communities should be under surveillance?
Well, I was a federal prosecutor like Matt.
That was uncharacteristically reasonable coming from Republican chair of the House Homeland Security Committee, Mike McCall, and I'm glad to see him recognize that. Oh, it looks like I'm. I'm going to check the comments here and see if we had like a break in the broadcast. Yeah. Let me see. I think that the broadcast should be working again, and I think I was showing a clip of Mike McCall. Let me see. I think that the last clip I was showing was I had shown you the lone wolf stories from George Stephanopoulos this week on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, Martha Raddatz, who asked Mike McCall about Peter King's comments about surveilling Muslims over in this clip.
Attack like this.
And Congressman McCall, your colleague, Congressman Peter King, said this week, we need to be more closely watching Muslim communities in the U.S. and go all out with surveillance and be quick to call it terrorism. Do you agree with him that these communities should be under surveillance?
Well, I was a federal prosecutor like Matt. Worked on FISAs. And look, yeah, surveillance of mosques is a very sensitive issue, but what I would urge would be that we have greater community involvement within the mosques. Remember Tamerlan Tsarnaev, the Boston bomber, got literally kicked out of his mosque, and yet there was no reporting of that at the time, and had there been, just maybe we could have stopped that particular bombing from happening. And it's very true of a lot of these cases where they do attend mosques. There is radical behavior. And I think it's more of the FBI and Homeland Security working with state and locals within the Muslim
and those
community.
local law enforcement.
So again, that was an uncharacteristically reasonable response, I thought, coming from the Republican chair of the House Homeland Security Committee, Mike McCall, and I'm glad to see him recognize that surveillance and demonization of Muslims is counterproductive because it alienates the very Muslims who are in the best position to identify the few violent people who are a threat. And on the topic of overreacting to Muslims, as I promised earlier in the show, I want to show a couple more clips of Bill Maher addressing the Islam issue, though after dealing with it for a couple weeks in a row earlier this month, I don't really want to spend too much time on it, which coincidentally is the attitude Bill Maher himself expressed on returning to the issue of Islam, as you can see over in this clip.
Let's talk about the other shooting. I actually don't want to because it brings us back to the Muslim issue, which I really don't want to talk about anymore. When we had Ben Affleck on the show a couple of weeks ago.
Heard about it.
Everybody talked about it. Trust me, I don't want to make this my life's mission to talk about this one issue. I turned on requests for interviews on this every day. But you know what? Like Michael Corleone, they keep pulling me back in.
Yeah, that's it, man.
So what happened was in Canada, of course. There was this shooting by this jihadist, and by the way, it was only one of 3 this week. There was an incident in Queens just today, or was it yesterday? A jihadist inspired by ISIS hatcheted some policemen. There was another one in Canada. I have been trying to make the point that people work backwards from the idea that it cannot be Islam, because that's a religion and religions are good. So what started all the ruckus with the Ben Affleck stuff was when I said on the previous show, if vast numbers of Muslims across the world believe, and they do, that humans deserve to die for merely holding a different idea, or drawing a cartoon, or writing a book, or eloping with the wrong person, not only does the Muslim world have something in common with ISIS, it has too much in common with ISIS. Now, rather
Now, there are real dangers in grouping together people who have certain beliefs with people who are planning violent acts they say are justified by those beliefs. And I'm actually working on a video that should be out this week about a mistake I think Sam Harris made on the difference between belief and an imminent threat. But I want to show a little more of that discussion on Real Time, where instead of arguing himself, Bill Maher decided to quote journalist Thomas Friedman of the New York Times and also conservative blogger Andrew Sullivan and journalist and their arguments really aren't all that great on this issue, at least the part that he quotes on the issue of Islam. And you can also see the pushback that Bill Maher got from Dr. Cornel West on the issue in this clip over here.
With ISIS. Now, rather than me keep talking about this, what you don't want to do, I thought today I would let some other people to talk in their quotes. Tom Friedman said a couple of weeks ago, talking about Islam, this is a civilization in distress, and unless it faces the pathologies that have given birth to an ISIS monster in its belly, any victory we will achieve will be temporary. That's Tom Friedman. Now, I know I'm a pothead and an atheist, and I never got married, and like a million reasons why you shouldn't believe. I'm a comedian, crazy. Here's Andrew Sullivan, who said, yes, there are Jewish extremists, murderous Buddhists, violent Christian extremists, but today, in too many parts of the world, no other religion comes close to the menace and violence of Islam. And if liberals cannot stand up for freedom of speech and assembly and religion and for toleration as a core value, what are liberals for? This particular religion at this moment in time is specifically dangerous and violent. And to argue to the reverse is simply denial.
But Brother Bill, see,
I'm just saying,
you already got the problem set, though. You see, if it's a false
just quoting.
Beginning with Mahmoud Muhammad Taha, there's a whole tradition with Islam that argues for rights, tolerance.
I think that's a given. That's the problem.
I don't see it.
Yeah, I mean,
you
look,
don't see it.
I think
it's not. No.
You got to be able.
Now, just because Bill Maher doesn't see the many different denominations and interpretations of Islam, including tolerant humanistic interpretations, doesn't mean they don't exist, though, like I said, I don't really want to get too far into the issue of Islam again, especially because I'm hoping to finish up that video on Thursday or Friday that will be titled Sam Harris Defamed as Islamophobic by Glenn Greenwald, Reza Eslan, ? So look for more details in that video. But before I leave the topic of lone wolves, I want to show how CNN handled the topic, grouping together years and years of Muslim lone wolves in Candy Crowley, the host of State of the Union. She was interviewing the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Dianne Feinstein. She's a Democrat, although I don't really consider her that much of a Democrat, especially because she's my senator from California, and that kind of embarrasses me. But you can see Candy Crowley kind of set up this question for her about all these lone wolves in asking her the question you can see over in this clip.
When you see in a single week, we saw what happened in Canada when a single gunman kills a soldier. We see a hatchet attack of all things. on police officers in Queens. Both men seem to have some affinity for, inspired by, somehow violent jihad. You add in a woman in Moore, Oklahoma, who was beheaded by a disgruntled worker who had recently, quote, converted to Islam. You have the attacks in Fort Hood. You have the Boston Marathon bombers who, went online and seemed somewhat inspired by violent jihad. Is this one big problem, or is it separate problems?
Oh, I think it's one big problem. I think one of the problems is that the internet, as well as certain specific Muslim extremists, are really firing up this lone wolf phenomenon. And these attacks and the multiplicity of attacks into any kind of value of a just system, ISIS doesn't make that case. ISIS is essentially a fighting force of 30 to 50,000 people, sophisticated with commanders, with some heavy weapons, and they are on a march now, and they're going to slay everything in their way.
In the proper
So I noticed about 3.5 minutes ago the broadcast cut out for some period of time. I don't know exactly how much of my narration or what clip was going at that time. I apologize for that. I don't know why the broadcast has crashed a couple times, and I know it's kind of messing up the recorded show, so I apologize for that. But I do want to kind of disagree with what my Senator Dianne Feinstein said there about how there isn't really some ideological justification for ISIS. I mean, I saw a pundit in a clip I decided not to pick for the show tonight, talk about how ISIS really does it wasn't a pundit, it was a reporter over on CBS's Face the Nation. I think it was Clarissa Ward, who I've shown reporting from the region, and she was on Face the Nation acting as a pundit. And in this clip I'm not going to show you, she talked about how ISIS declaring itself a caliphate actually does have resonance, especially for people who are, people in their 20s who are lost, and especially young men who don't have an identity and have issues, kind of like these lone wolves who we've been talking about. And they actually present themselves as, the victims of a war on Islam by the West, and that actually is a justice-based, even though I don't think that's true. It's something that is sort of a justice-based ideology that people can use that ISIS uses to recruit people who don't have anything to work for in their lives or whatever. So I want to disagree with Senator Dianne Feinstein, but she did make a good transition from this whole lone wolf story that was the main coverage of ISIS on the shows this week, and there wasn't really much coverage of the military action, even though the United States continues to bomb in Iraq and Syria, and other nations in the coalition do. But I want to show just a couple, 2 or 3 quick clips on that. Yeah, 3 clips. First, this is a Democratic senator who's kind of one of the most centrist of all the Democrats in the Senate, Senator Joe Manchin, and he was on CBS's Face the Nation, which was hosted by Charlie Rose this morning, and Charlie Rose asked him about, whether we need to send in ground troops, and he was, well, first he actually asked him this question that he meant to ask his next guest by mistake, and then I'll show Mike Rogers, which I'll show in a minute, and then he corrected himself. It's kind of a good evidence that these hosts have producers who are always talking their ears, because you can see Charlie Rose change his question in the middle when his producer tells him in his earpiece that he's made a mistake, and he's like asking the question for the next guest. And but it does get a good response from Senator Joe Manchin, showing that even the most centrist of Democrats is opposed to going back and using ground troops when that's like the definition of insanity, doing over and over again the same thing and expecting different results. Over in this clip.
But you just returned, I think, from London, where you talked to some officials of the British government. Mike Rogers just returned, and we'll talk about that with him. But do you support what the president has done with respect to fighting ISIS in Syria?
I'm not for putting American troops on the ground. I did not vote to go in there and try to find 5,000 of the Syrian rebels who we could think that would be kind and considerate and compassionate towards our desires, pay $500 million and expect them to turn around and fight the ISIS, and then turn around and fight Assad and expect us to get drawn into a civil war. I don't think after 13 years, if we've learned nothing, and I've said in the great state of West Virginia, we have a little common sense and we understand the definition of insanity. Continue to do the same thing and expect something different to happen. With that being said, it should be, we should take the air war. We'll be happy to help tactical and technically, helping you with the air war, but it should be an Arab-Muslim ground war. The Saudis have to engage. The Turks have to engage. The Kurds are the only one that seems to want to fight and defend and die for what they believe in. And until we see the other regions, we're not going to change that, Charlie. If we can contain them there, leave them there, I don't know what else to do. They're intent on destroying each other, and they've been doing it for 1,400 years. And the bottom line is, I think we should be very clear in our position in the world, is if you plan, if you're training to do harm to Americans, we'll come and take you out wherever you are.
Senator, thank
you. So I think that's a good representation of the centrist Democratic point of view. That's one of the more right-wing parts of the Democratic Party, because there are actually some Democrats who don't favor the airstrikes at all. Joe Manchin is more centrist because he favors the airstrikes, but no U.S. ground troops in Iraq or Syria, which you can see. I'm going to get to the Republican congressperson Mike Rogers, who Charlie Rose thought he was asking that question to. Here you can see him ask that question about how he just returned from Britain and other places, and he says, did you talk the Brits into putting their airstrikes into Syria, not just into Iraq? Because I guess Great Britain is only bombing Iraq, not Syria right now, as if the Republican congressman is the one who should be conducting U.S. foreign policy. I think that would kind of be improper if a Republican, even the Republican, what is he? He's the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, who's retiring, Mike Rogers. He shouldn't be convincing the British to start bombing into different countries than they're currently bombing, I don't think. But anyway, you can see Charlie Rose ask him that question, and of course get the answer that the problem is the lack of Obama's strategy, blaming the Obama administration over in this clip.
Morning, Charlie. You just returned from Britain and other places, and as I said, the Brits have taken a position they'll do what they can do in Iraq, but not in Syria.
Yeah.
Were you successful in trying to change their mind?
Well, we had a lot of very constructive conversations, both with their Parliamentary Security Committee folks and their intelligence services and defense individuals. Let me say this, Charlie. One of the things that I think has shocked our British friends is this lack of strategy. I think that they'll be with us if we can put together a coherent strategy for Syria and Iraq. I really do believe that.
So what kind of...
So, and I cut it there before the next clip I'm about to show, where you can see from Republican Mike Rogers, you can compare him to what I showed you from Senator Joe Manchin. This is definitely a much more militaristic approach, where he's about to advocate, using a lot more ground troops, certainly than Senator Joe Manchin, and certainly than the Obama administration is willing to go for at this point. And you can see that when Charlie Rose on CBS's Face the Nation this morning asked him, so what would your strategy be, or what would you do over in this case?
What strategy do we need that we do not have now?
Well, if you think about what we're doing, we're really small pecks at a very big problem. And so what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to further engage our NATO allies. We're going to need to allow special forces capability soldiers, both from Britain and the United States and others, to go downrange with these individuals that we have trained, both Iraq, the Iraqi soldiers, Peshmerga, and even in Syria, that would allow more effective effective fighting on the ground.
So that's putting combat troops on the ground, isn't it?
Well, I think we didn't have a war with ISIS in the beginning. We had a war on semantics. And that is just a dangerous place to be. I think when people think about boots on the ground, they're thinking big maneuver elements, divisions, brigades, battalions. No one's talking about that, although I don't think we should eliminate it, but nobody's
so if
talking
it's necessary, you'd recommend it. If
well,
the military says we need American boots on the ground in Syria to stop ISIS, you're in favor.
If that means, well, here's my concern. If we don't do this smaller, more effective thing now, we will get to the point where we're going to have big maneuver military elements. Special forces capability, special capability soldiers, and intelligence officials are needed if you're going to be more impactful. If you put a 20-year plan together to beat ISIL, you'll have 40 years of trouble.
Let me move.
So, I don't know, I guess that is the justification you get there from the Republican, more hawkish Republican Mike Rogers saying we have to put more boots on the ground and more combat troops now, because if we plan for this slow 20-year conflict, which I think may be a reference to something that Hillary Clinton recently said, that the war against Islamic extremists and ISIS is going to take like 20 years, and I think there was it Defense Secretary Leon, former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta said 30 years, and so Mike Rogers is saying that you need to do more now so that it's not 40 years instead of 20 years, or I don't know. You can tell me what you think. You notice most of the clips about ISIS this week were about the lone wolf threat, even though as bad as that incident was in the Canadian Parliament, and the other like incident in Canada where somebody ran over a couple Canadian soldiers, and of course the like crazed guy with a hatchet who attacked the police in New York, I think the casualties from that were less than the school shooting in that town in the state of Washington north of Seattle, and there was like no coverage at all, or very little coverage, not no coverage at all, but most of the programs didn't cover it at all. I think Fox News Sunday, there was like a vague reference to school shootings in general in the panel discussion, but no reference to this specific one. Over on CBS's Face the Nation, Charlie Rose did ask Senator Joe Manchin about the shooting specifically, because he was one of these moderate Democrats who tried to get background checks through the Senate and failed back after the Sandy Hook shooting, and showed like the power of the NRA to stop legislation. And if you want to show why there was almost no coverage and nothing happened, I think you can see it from Senator Joe Manchin's answer here, because he's really defensive even about like the minimal background check bill that he tried to get through the Senate. You can see his answer is really defensive, like, oh, it wasn't anything. We didn't really try to do anything. I don't know what you're saying, Charlie Rose, in answer to the question you can see over here.
You have addressed the issue of guns. We've had another shooting incident. Is guns, are they an issue in this election?
You would like to think that we could have elected officials with enough fortitude to basically look at gun sense. I'm a lifetime member of the NRA. I'm a gun person. I just came off of a hunt yesterday, and we were hunters feeding the hungry. I enjoy this, and I think it's for good purpose. But with that being said, you've got to have gun sense. If I don't know who you are, Charlie, I'm a law-abiding gun owner. Treat me that as a law-abiding person. I'm not going to do something wrong just because I own a gun. But I also, in a law-abiding gun owner, be responsible that if I go to a commercial gun show, if I go on the internet, I want to know who wants to buy my gun, and I would think they'd want to know who they're selling their gun to. That's common gun sense. And most of America and most gun owners agree with that. That's all we did.
Yeah, that's all we did, Charlie, is like the most minimal possible thing anyone could even think of to do in response to the Sandy Hook shooting. And of course that didn't pass because of the NRA. So, and you can see from the defensive posture of Senator Joe Manchin there, who, you know, he's the senator from West Virginia. I think in one of his ads he like shot the Obamacare bill, or was it, I can't remember, or was it some sort of Clean Air Act bill or something that would have regulated coal. I can't remember. Maybe I'm misremembering the whole thing, but I think it was Senator Joe Manchin who like fired a rifle into some like big phone book looking bill thing. And so he's one of those people who tries to be pro-gun and also a Democrat, and you can see that he's trying to backtrack from the little bit of gun control legislation, or just these background checks, which isn't even really gun control. It's just like finding out who's buying the guns and making sure they're don't have mental health or criminal holds on them. So anyway, that's the one clip I want to show you, because like I said, there was very little coverage at all of this shooting, and just sort of an oblique reference to it over on Fox News Sunday, and Meet the Press didn't cover it, and This Week with George Stephanopoulos I don't think covered it all either. So I want to get to what was the main topic of the coverage, Ebola, which of course there was breaking news during the last or the breaking news from the last week is this case of a doctor who came down with it in New York, and some people calling for all health workers who come back from West Africa to be quarantined. I'm going to get to that, but first I like to start with one of the political comedy clips. This is the one from last night's Saturday Night Live Weekend Update. The co-anchor Michael Che, who used to be on The Daily Show, he seems to cover the racial aspect of things, of course, and which he used to do in his stand-up comedy, which I have watched and enjoyed over the years. And I want to show how he looked at how Ebola is kind of like black people in this couple jokes he told on Weekend Update last night over in this clip.
According to a new phone poll, 45% of Americans are concerned that they'll get Ebola. The other 55% wouldn't answer the phone because they thought that might be the way you get Ebola. I'm sick of the Ebola panic. I mean, where have I heard this before? It's mostly white people afraid of it, but it's killing mostly black people. Kind of like black people. I'm not saying black people are like Ebola. I'm saying we're treated the same. I mean, nobody thinks about us till we show up in your neighborhood at your favorite bowling alley and go home with a few white girls. And then it's, oh, we got to do something about this.
I don't know. That was a kind of interesting take on the whole Ebola thing, but I was actually more concerned with this whole quarantine issue. A quarantine has actually been imposed on health workers coming back from West Africa, and it's actually been physically mandated on people coming into the airport, especially there was this one healthcare worker, I think she might have been an epidemiologist, they didn't really say, but although she referred to herself as an epidemiologist, because as an epidemiologist in a clip I'm going to show later, because over on CNN State of the Union they actually had an interview with her, which unfortunately is on her cell phone and it kind of cuts in and out. But before I get to that, I want to show sort of a background update from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, talking about this New York doctor who got Ebola and is now in Bellevue Hospital, and of course the quarantine of this healthcare worker, Kaci Hickox, and the name of the reporter, Lindsay Davis, is doing this update on the latest breaking news on Ebola over in this clip.
Healthcare worker Kaci Hickox, the first high-risk traveler automatically quarantined in New Jersey, has tested negative for Ebola but remains under mandatory quarantine. In an open letter to the Dallas Morning News, she says she was treated like a criminal when she returned home from treating Ebola patients in Sierra Leone. Of her arrival at Newark Airport, she writes, "I sat alone in the isolation tent and thought of many colleagues who will return home to America and face the same ordeal." She says she was held for 6 hours, grilled by officials, and given only a granola bar and water, detained even after her temperature was taken at a healthy 98 degrees. On Saturday, New Jersey Governor Christie responded.
"I'm sorry if in any way she was inconvenienced, but the inconvenience that could occur from having folks who are symptomatic and ill out amongst the public is a much, much greater concern of mine."
Late Saturday, Florida joined Illinois, New York, and New Jersey, all now imposing their own mandatory 21-day quarantine, far stricter than the federal requirements for high-risk travelers entering the U.S. Ashoka Mukpo, the freelance journalist who recovered from the virus, says the quarantine policy threatens those on the front lines of the fight against Ebola.
So to do anything that makes it more difficult for those people to go is not the right thing to do right now.
Hickox is one of 4 people in the New York area now quarantined by state order. Another, Morgan Dixon, seen here returning late last night to the Harlem apartment she shares with fiancé and Ebola patient Dr. Craig Spencer, who's still hospitalized.
Hickox's attorney tells ABC News they believe the state's quarantine policy infringes on her liberty interest, and they're preparing to challenge it. Martha?
And I think that's really true. I have real concerns about the way they've imposed this quarantine because it's not really based on the scientific evidence, and it's really arbitrary. There are people who aren't being quarantined, and by the end of this series of clips, like I said, I'm going to show several actual clips of Kaci Hickox, this healthcare worker, and she makes her case pretty well if it weren't for her cell phone cutting in and out every now and then. And but another person who also made the case was the head of the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases, Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is also famous virologist who helped isolate the HIV virus. And he was over on Fox News Sunday, and even Chris Wallace was couching his questions in a way that was favorable to the view that science says you shouldn't have these quarantines, and kind of teed up Dr. Anthony Fauci to give that view over in this clip.
Welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
As we've just mentioned, the governors of New York and New Jersey have instituted this mandatory quarantine for all people coming back from West Africa through their airports who've had direct contact with Ebola patients, including all medical workers. Here is Governor Chris Christie announcing it.
New Jersey and New York are going to determine the standards of quarantine since CDC's guidance is continually changing, and we need to set a standard for our 2 states.
Given that people are not contagious until they show symptoms, is it good science to quarantine them for 21 days?
Okay. First principle, protect American people. Second principle, make your decision based on the science. Right now, as we've said many times, people who are without symptoms do not transmit Ebola. We know that. So guidelines regarding how you handle people from coming back should always be based on the science. And the science tells us that people who are asymptomatic do not transmit. That doesn't mean we're cavalier about it, but that means there are other steps that you can protect American people based on the scientific evidence that does not necessarily have to go so far as to possibly have unintended consequences of disincentivizing healthcare workers. The best way to protect us is to stop the epidemic in Africa, and we need those healthcare workers. So we do not want to put them in a position where it makes it very, very uncomfortable for them to even volunteer to go. That would be an unintended
I want to press
consequence.
on this, though. So you're saying that this mandatory 21-day quarantine, especially for people who are completely asymptomatic, is not good science?
Well, if you're talking about an asymptomatic person, there's a way to monitor them. You could do it by active and direct monitoring that would accomplish the same thing. The difficulty when you put someone in a position is that if you're going to go over there, when you come back, no matter what you do, no symptoms, you're not at a high risk, you still have 21 days out of your life where you can't move, I think will have unintended negative consequences.
So you're against the 21-day quarantine?
Personally, myself, as a physician scientist, I would not have recommended that.
So that's the farthest Dr. Anthony Fauci would go on most of the shows, and he was on just about all of them, or even all of them. I'm not sure. He might have done the full Ginsburg. I can't recall. I think he was on 4 of the 5 shows, but he might have been on all 5. Anyway, that's the furthest he would go in criticizing the quarantine imposed by these governors, including Governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie. And I'm going to show a few clips from him. Although you notice in that clip I showed of Chris Christie, the clip before last, where he talked about the inconvenience he imposed on this healthcare worker, Kaci Hickox, but it is nothing compared to the problem of someone who is, ill and symptomatic walking around. But the problem is she isn't ill or symptomatic, and you'll see her like slamming him on that in the interview she has with CNN's Crowley on State of the Union that I'll show in a little bit. But first I want to show a couple clips of Christie trying to justify this quarantine that he imposed really arbitrarily. And I'll sort of criticize it along the way, but first I want to show him make his argument with Chris Wallace actually challenging him about it not being based on good science over in this clip.
Governor, you just heard, and we want to talk, before we get to politics, to this whole controversy about Ebola and the quarantine. You just heard Dr. Fauci, New York City's health commissioner. Dr. Mary Bassett says, reportedly, was furious that she was not informed before the quarantine was imposed. Do you no longer trust the CDC and doctors and scientists?
Well, no, that's a pretty general statement, Chris. Of course we do. But the fact of the matter is that the CDC protocols, as Dr. Fauci admitted himself, have been a moving target. And imagine that you're the person in charge of the public health of the people of a large, densely populated state. In fact, the most densely populated state in the Union. And these protocols continue to move and change. It was my conclusion that we needed to do this to protect the public health of the people of New Jersey. Governor Cuomo agreed, and now Mayor Emanuel agrees. And I think the CDC eventually will come around to our point of view on this.
No, I hope that's not true. I hope that the CDC doesn't take the non-scientific view, because as I'll talk about a little later, it actually is more harmful than hurtful, and I'll show a couple really strong arguments about that, in addition to the one you saw from Anthony Fauci already. But you can see Chris Wallace confronts Governor of New Jersey, Christie, a little more skeptically about his science, about not believing scientists, and here's how Christie responds to that over in this clip.
And what about Dr. Fauci, who says it's just not good science to quarantine people when they're not symptomatic because they can't spread the disease in those situations?
Well, listen, I have great respect for Dr. Fauci, but what he's counting on is a voluntary system with folks who may or may not comply. We had this situation in New Jersey, Chris, as you know, with the NBC News crew that said that they were going to self-quarantine, and then 2 days later, they were out picking up takeout food in Princeton and walking around the streets of Princeton. I mean, the fact of the matter is that I don't believe, when you're dealing with something as serious as this, that we can count on a voluntary system. This is government's job. If anything else, the government's job is to protect the safety and health of our citizens. And so we've taken this action, and I absolutely have no second thoughts about it.
Well, that's not very comforting that he doesn't have any second thoughts about it, especially because there are all sorts of problems with the policy, and I'll show some of those later. Like, you know, he talked about that NBC News crew, but I don't think they're actually, news crews aren't covered by the quarantine. And also, what about like the people who are treating this doctor at Bellevue Hospital, you know, the doctor in New York who came down with Ebola just this week, and after being non-symptomatic and going to the bowling alley and going to, you know, on the subway, and people got all upset about that, but he wasn't symptomatic. And also, I noticed when that was reported, a lot of news outlets said he had 103-degree fever. I even saw a video by Lee Doran, you know, on the How the World Works channel, advocating for, even though he's supposedly this libertarian, he advocated for taking away people's freedom because of this threat that doesn't really exist. And one of the things he mentioned was this 103-degree fever. But it turns out that the doctor who was now in Bellevue, the temperature he had was 100.3, not 103. 100.3, that was a mistake in transcription or something. And 100.3, if in case you don't know, if you're not married to a doctor like I am, 100.3 isn't actually a fever. You have to be over 100.4 for there to be a fever. So the temperature 100.3 is not 103-degree fever, and the self-monitoring really works, especially from healthcare workers who, you know the best. As you know, if you're a healthcare worker who just came back from working with Ebola patients in Africa, who's going to be more motivated than you to like check your temperature twice a day and look for symptoms, and you know, the first time you notice anything, to get yourself to a hospital as soon as possible, which is basically what this doctor did. And I'll talk about that a little more after I want to show one more clip from Governor of New Jersey, Christie, where he's confronted with this argument about how putting this quarantine on healthcare workers will disincentivize healthcare workers from going to fight the real problem, which is Ebola in Africa. And if we don't stop it there, it's just going to make things worse for us here. Not to mention, it being just enough of a problem with more than 10,000 cases in Africa this week is one of the news items I don't think I showed in any of the clips. But anyway, here's how Christie responds to the unintended consequences argument over in this clip.
Well, let me just ask you about one other aspect of it. Dr. Fauci talked about the unintended consequence. Everyone agrees that the only way you're going to stop this crisis is to end Ebola in West Africa. And the concern is that the medical workers, the doctors, the nurses that are willing to take their chances and go over there, when they hear now that they're going to have to undergo a mandatory 3-week quarantine, when they come back, may decide not to go in the first place. And in fact, the first nurse who has gone through the quarantine in New Jersey says that she feels she was badly treated. So are you concerned that you're going to disincentivize people from going over there to help stop the outbreak?
No, I'm really not, Chris, because I believe that folks who want to take that step and are willing to volunteer also understand that it's in their interest and in the public health interest to have a 21-day period thereafter if they've been directly exposed to people with the virus. And as we saw with what happened with some of the healthcare workers in Texas, with the CDC shifting protocols, we had people who were infected from that type of contact. And we just can't have that in the New York, New Jersey area. And that's why Governor Cuomo and I agree on this. And now you see that they agree in Chicago as well. I think this is a policy that will become a national policy sooner rather than later.
All right. Let's.
Like I said, I hope he's not right about that. But, where he says he hopes that Kaci Hickox understands that what he's doing is for her health and for the health of the people of New Jersey. But the problem is it isn't. It actually isn't helping anybody's health. It's not protecting anyone, and it's actually hurting the problem. Like I said, because of the way it disincentivizes healthcare workers from going over there, and especially because when you hear from Kaci Hickox about her current situation and the way she's been treated, it's basically she's in jail for 3 weeks. She spent a month already in this really difficult situation and whatever. I'm going to show her talking about that from her own mouth in a few minutes. But first I want to show from ABC, this is one more clip from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, where Dr. Anthony Fauci specifically addresses the treatment of this healthcare worker, Kaci Hickox, and the unfairness of it over in this clip.
Just diseases. Dr. Fauci, I want to go straight to the issue with this nurse. She was kept in a tent. She writes in this editorial, I am scared. I am scared about how health workers will be treated. No one seemed to be in charge. No one would tell me what was going on and what would happen to me. Is this how people are being trained to deal with people?
Well, first of all, 2 principles. 1, we need to protect the American public. But 2, we need to make the decisions based on scientific data. And we know that people who are without symptoms are not a threat to transmitting it. You don't get Ebola unless you come into direct contact with body fluid. So there are things that we've got to be careful.
Which Governor Christie even said she was symptomatic and ill. She wasn't symptomatic and ill.
And the point is, the scientific evidence is what needs to drive us. You appreciate the fears of the American people, but you don't want to have a policy that would have negative unintended consequences.
So how did this happen? How did this healthcare worker come in and be treated like that?
I cannot explain that, Martha. I can just tell you that what we want to do is to make sure, first, protect the American public, but do so based on scientific data. And we keep repeating over and over again, the scientific data tells us that people who are without symptoms, with whom you don't come into contact with body fluids, are not a threat. They will not get infected.
So, yeah, that's the Dr. Anthony Fauci from the National Institutes of Health explaining why this healthcare worker, Kaci Hickox, has been totally mistreated. This quarantine isn't based on any scientific need or evidence. And regarding it being a disincentive to healthcare workers, I want to show a couple clips from the executive director of Doctors Without Borders in the United States. Her name is Sophie Delauney. It's a French name, and I always mispronounce French, but I think it's Sophie Delauney, talking to Chuck Todd on Meet the Press first about whether the quarantine is going to stop healthcare workers from going over and helping people in West Africa, over in this clip.
Good morning, Chuck.
Let me start with these new now mandatory orders that are taking place in New York, in New Jersey, Illinois, and Florida. Are you already finding that you have doctors and other healthcare workers backing out of volunteer trips to the affected areas?
Well, you know, frankly speaking, we are totally confused about these orders because we have put in place over the past few months protocols that are based on well-known medical science and accepted. And those protocols have been strictly followed by our staff. They consist of self-monitoring, very strict self-monitoring. We ask our volunteers coming back from West Africa to monitor their temperature twice a day during 21 days, to continue their malaria prophylaxis in order to avoid that there would be a confusion between malaria symptoms and Ebola, which can be similar. And more importantly, we recommend that they report those symptoms as soon as they realize that they exist. And this is actually the protocol that our colleague Craig has strictly followed this week.
Yeah, so you can see there the executive director of Doctors Without Borders defends this doctor who's now in Bellevue Hospital with Ebola, Dr. Craig, and says that he did follow the protocols. And like I said, he only had a temperature of 100.3 when he was rushed by EMT workers or EMS workers in hazmat suits to Bellevue Hospital. And also the executive director of Doctors Without Borders there, Sophie Delauney, specifically addressed the question of whether he had put any New Yorkers in danger in response to a question from Chuck Todd on NBC's Meet the Press this morning over in this clip.
This week.
You believe that Dr. Spencer did not put any New Yorkers in harm's way?
Well, what we know from medical science is that a person who does not present symptoms is very unlikely to transmit the disease. And even though the disease can only be transmitted through the exchange of body fluids, right. So it's it's actually impossible that a person living, for example, in the same building than an infected person who does not present symptoms could be at risk of being infected with Ebola.
Is there any
So there you can see, like I said, the executive director of Doctors Without Borders saying that this doctor in New York did not put anyone in danger when he was going around the city without symptoms, because people who don't have symptoms aren't contagious, and so they don't transmit the Ebola virus. And I also want to show, this is Dr. Anthony Fauci again over on CBS's Face the Nation talking to Charlie Rose about whether self-monitoring is effective, and also whether we should put in place things that aren't necessary but stop public panic, which, I don't know, that doesn't seem reasonable to me, especially when you're putting people in confinement for 3 weeks. But you can see Dr. Anthony Fauci's answer to that question over in this clip.
The governors would say two things. Number one, if you look at monitoring, it doesn't seem necessarily to work, self-monitoring. Right. And two, we have a responsibility to make sure that panic doesn't set in.
That is correct, and that's appreciated and understood. When you look at the kinds of monitoring continually on an everyday basis, making sure we're getting it right and doing it right. And as you'll see, the monitoring protocols that will be put into place will be able to be tailored according to the scientific evaluation of the risk. So when you put everyone in the same basket, that's the thing that we're concerned about.
So yeah, when he's talking about putting everyone in the same basket, he's saying quarantining everyone who comes back from West Africa and has worked as a health worker with Ebola patients, which doesn't really make scientific sense. And I'll get to that a little more when I show some clips from the actual healthcare worker who's been put in this quarantine that seems a lot like jail to me anyway. And but before I do that, I want to show one more clip of Dr. Anthony Fauci specifically talking about what the biggest piece of misinformation is on the whole Ebola issue. And he's talking about whether it's contagious from people who aren't symptomatic. And you can see that clip over here.
Of all the things that you have seen so far, what is it that you think must be rebutted so as not to cause fear?
Well, I think that rather than rebut is to just keep stating the fundamental principles. When someone is without symptoms, if you do not come into contact with their body fluid, this is not spread the way other diseases like influenza or other types of respiratory diseases are spread, where you and I could be talking and I'm a little bit sick and I go like that and you could get you don't get Ebola that way. That's the thing we have to make absolutely certain. Look at the experience. The only two people in the United States who've gotten Ebola are brave healthcare nurses who have taken care of a patient who is seriously ill.
What's the most important thing?
And, you know, in addition to Dr. Anthony Fauci, who isn't really a spokesman for the Obama administration, I want to show one more clip. This is from Face the Nation also, I believe, where, sorry, I dropped my list of clips there. This is a clip actually from Meet the Press, where they seem to have caught up with Samantha Power, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, who's more a direct representative of the Obama administration, and she's also praising these healthcare workers and basically coming out against the quarantine by saying that we should treat our returning healthcare workers who are going to West Africa as heroes, when she's about to get on a plane to go to West Africa herself, as you can see over in this clip.
Us need to make clear what these health workers mean to us and how much we value their service, how much we value their contribution. We need to encourage more. We need many more than are going right now. And we need to find a way when they come home that they are treated like conquering heroes and not stigmatized for the tremendous work that they have done.
And so, yeah, that is definitely something I agree with. And if you want to understand what Samantha Power, Ambassador Samantha Power, is saying there about stigmatizing people instead of treating them as conquering heroes, you have to hear more details about the story of this healthcare worker, Kaci Hickox, who was quarantined basically without any notice, not even knowing it was going to happen, on her return from West Africa, coming into the airport in New Jersey, and also being basically lied about. Her health condition was lied about by the governor of New Jersey, Christie, which, I don't know, that should be scandalous, I think. But anyway, first you can see the beginning of her interview with Candy Crowley on CNN State of the Union, where she described what happened when she came into the airport in Newark, New Jersey, over in this clip.
Happened once you landed at Newark.
That's correct, Candy. I spent a month in Sierra Leone, and when I arrived at the airport in Newark, I, of course, presented my paperwork to the immigration official and told him that I had been in Sierra Leone. So I verbally declared it myself as well as writing it in the documentation. And he was very nice and said, okay, well, they'll have a couple of questions. There were many people that asked me questions. No one seems to be leading or coordinating the effort. A lot of the questions were repetitive. And as an epidemiologist, I was surprised that, I saw people writing in the margins of their paperwork, which just showed that obviously they weren't prepared to really capture all the information they thought they needed. Obviously, I was there for many hours. My plane was on 12:30, and I only left for the isolation center around.
So yeah, I warned you earlier that she was on her iPhone and it didn't have really good cell phone reception, so she kind of fades in and out during her answers, unfortunately. That's, like I said, Kaci Hickox, who is this healthcare worker who was detained when she got to the airport. And then in her next answer, she talks about what it's like to be at the hospital, and she doesn't fault the people at the hospital, but she does really fault Governor Christie of New Jersey and basically the lies he told about her health condition that you can hear about over in this clip.
Once I got to the hospital, they, of course, tested my blood. They asked me a few more questions. I do want to say everyone here, all of the doctors and nurses that have been caring for me and EMS workers have been fantastic, so supportive. They've offered to get me books and to bring me Pizza Hut, and they're fantastic. They've definitely gotten caught up in a political mess, so I don't envy them either. But yes, they tested my blood, and as you know, it's negative. She also confirmed that it was negative. And I know that there have been reports of me having a fever in the airport, but I truly believe that it was an instrument error. They were using the forehead scanner, and I was obviously distressed and a bit upset. And so my cheeks were flushed, and I think there has been some evidence that machine is not very accurate in these kind of situations. So when I arrived in the isolation unit, they took my temperature orally, and it was completely normal.
And does it remain completely normal?
Yes, it has also been completely normal. I heard from my mother last night, who called me concerned and said, Governor Christie just said in an interview that you were, quote unquote, obviously ill. And this is so frustrating to me. First of all, I don't think he's a doctor. And secondly, he's never laid eyes on me. And thirdly, I have been asymptomatic since I've been here. I feel physically completely strong and emotionally completely exhausted. But for him to say I'm obviously ill, which is even a strange statement, what does that mean? Someone define that for me, because I think I don't quite understand what obviously ill means. But I am here to tell you that I am completely fine physically, and being held here is just, I just don't understand.
Yeah, you can see she kind of cuts out at the end there saying she doesn't understand why, when she's completely fine, she's being quarantined. And because, as I showed in previous clips, people who don't show symptoms can't transmit the disease. They're not contagious. And she kind of slammed Governor Christie of New Jersey there in ways that I think he pretty much deserved for talking about her as being obviously ill when she hasn't had any symptoms or any problems at all. And she's even tested negative for Ebola, although that test isn't accurate until you start showing symptoms. But I want to show there are a couple more clips. First, about the conditions of her confinement. Like I said earlier, basically she's being held in jail. It's like a medical jail, and you can see how she describes it. That's clip number 25, right here.
I am outside of the university hospital itself in a different building, I believe, although I can only say what I can see from my tent. I am in a tent within a building, and it's just a basic tent structure. There's a hospital bed, obviously, to bring me food. I have kind of a porta potty type restroom, no shower facilities, and no connection with the outside world except my iPhone, which I insisted that I brought with me when I arrived late Friday night.
So
yeah, she's got the iPhone, but no TV or books or anything to read. And she just flew back from Africa and she hasn't been able to take a shower. I think in another segment that I didn't take a clip from on a different show, they talked about how she's been able to give herself a sponge bath. Or did I show that ABC? Maybe that was in the ABC clip I showed. But in this next clip where she talks about why it is she doesn't understand why she's being quarantined, in the background they actually show pictures of her porta potty, which almost looks like using a trash bag to go to the bathroom with like a little seat around it. But, you'll see some pictures in the background, and it's while she's talking about or she's answering a question from CNN's Candy Crowley, where she says, well, don't you understand the mindset where this person, could spike a fever and start being contagious? And, of course, that's also inaccurate because, like I said earlier, this Dr. Craig, who it was taken to Bellevue, he had a temperature of 100.3, which technically is not a fever, not till it's over 100.4. And so he was taken to Bellevue, by these EMS workers in hazmat suits as soon as he had any symptoms. So the chances are basically infinitesimal that he transmitted it to any of these other people, on the subway or at the bowling alley and all that. But you can see Candy Crowley try to get Kaci Hickox to understand the mindset of people who are worried, and you can see a really strong response from her that she doesn't understand, much stronger than you heard from Dr. Anthony Fauci. But of course, she's the one who's had her liberty taken away, and so you can see her make that response to Candy Crowley over in this clip.
So let me ask you this from a different point of view. You have been over in Sierra Leone. I think everyone would salute someone who really does put their life on the line to go over and help others. And we have heard over and over again while you have been away how vital it is for all countries to send workers, doctors, nurses, other healthcare workers to fight this disease where it is in order to, save those countries as well as protect the rest of the world. But understanding that the doctor who is now in quarantine in New York City was home 7 or 8 days before he spiked a bit of a fever and then was put into isolation. Do you understand the need of governors, be they from New Jersey or New York or Illinois, to say, we can't take this risk that somebody is out there with a fever or will spike a fever 8 or 9 days after they arrive? We need to make sure that they're in isolation till we know they are past the danger zone. Do you understand that psyche?
I completely don't understand it. It is completely not understandable to me. It is not based on any clear public health evidence, and it's not the recommendation of public health and medical experts at this point. I think we have to be very careful about letting politicians make medical and public health decisions. And all of the evidence about Ebola shows that if you are not symptomatic, you are not infectious. So, for instance, when I arrived, I was not symptomatic, and that Friday evening they tested my blood and I am negative. So if I have symptoms and my blood is negative for Ebola, there's no way I can be confused. For anyone to tell me that I need to be and under a quarantine, this is completely unacceptable, and I believe,
Yeah, so I think that's a pretty strong reaction from Kaci Hickox on why she doesn't understand the mindset, because it's not based on any actual evidence. The mindset that is causing people to support this quarantine. And I also, in the next clip, you can see Candy Crowley talks a little bit, or gets her to talk a little bit about how this is going to be a disincentive to healthcare workers, because she quotes to Kaci Hickox this, but before she came on CNN State of the Union this morning, the only contact with her, the only news from her had been this open letter she'd written, I think it was in the Dallas Morning News. And one of the things she said, well, you can see Candy Crowley's going to quote from her about how this quarantine is going to be really frightening to people, and for her to explain it. And she basically says it's frightening because it's not based on any evidence, and it's really inhumane, especially because they're not letting her know what's going to happen to her. And you can see that over in this one.
The things that you wrote was, I'm scared, talking about other workers coming back, that they will arrive and see a frenzy of disorganization, et cetera, and most frightening, a quarantine. Can you tell me why the quarantine, of the fear that you certainly must have felt thinking, what are these people up to? Getting, a police ride with sirens and everything to the hospital. So I understand that fear and not knowing what's going on. But tell me what's frightening about a quarantine.
For me, it's two things, and I've experienced it. So unfortunately, I think I can say these two things pretty confidently. And the first is that this is not evidence-based. For instance, are all of the workers that are taking care of me being quarantined. No, they're seeing me in their PPE, and then they're going home to their families. So the quarantine does, in its, in how it's being carried out, it doesn't make sense. It's not evidence-based. And the second thing is, it's really inhumane. I just came back from one of the most difficult months of my life, and I am completely asymptomatic. And no one knows, no one can predict if I will develop Ebola or not in the next 21 days. And most aid workers who come back will not develop Ebola. So to quarantine everyone in case, when you cannot predict who may develop Ebola or not, and to make me stay for 21 days, to not be with my family, to put me through this emotional and physical stress is completely unacceptable.
Casey.
And, you really got to feel for that woman, Kaci Hickox there, having just come back from this really heroic effort to try to save people in West Africa, and having planned on spending a month there, to be told that now she's going to be possibly living in this tent with no contact other than her iPhone with the outside world for 3 weeks, even though there's no scientific evidence that says she's a danger to anyone. And like she said in that answer, it doesn't even really make sense, because there are these people who are now treating her, they're afraid of her being contagious, but they're treating her wearing the same equipment she was wearing when she was in West Africa. But then why aren't those healthcare workers also quarantined? It doesn't make any sense. And then also the people who are treating that doctor in New York, how come they're not under quarantine? Because they're treating someone who has Ebola. So shouldn't the whole thing it's arbitrary, and it's not based on the scientific evidence. And anyway, I want to show one more clip of this healthcare worker, Kaci Hickox, before I go to a few other Ebola related clips. And this is one where Candy Crowley on CNN State of the Union gives her a nice little setup. Is there anything you want to say to New Jersey Governor Christie for imposing this arbitrary, non-evidence-based quarantine on you? Well, that's not actually what Candy Crowley says, but you can see, I think in this one, again, Kaci Hickox really slams Governor Christie for spreading this misinformation about her health condition on the news, and I'll talk about that a little more after I show you that clip. Over number 29, I believe. No, number 28 here.
He said as recently as this morning is that he's sorry that this has been an inconvenience to you, but that he's trying to protect a public that he feels, particularly in densely populated areas, has not been properly protected by the CDC and this administration. I wanted to give you this chance to talk to Governor Christie. What would you say to him?
The first thing I would say to Governor Christie is that I wish that he would be more careful about his statements related to my medical condition. I am not, as he said, quote, unquote, obviously ill. I am completely healthy and with no symptoms. And if he knew anything about Ebola, he would know that asymptomatic people are not infectious. I understand that people feel like they have a risk, and I think we can have a conversation about what further measures might look like. But I think this is an extreme that is really unacceptable, and I feel like my basic human rights have been violated. And I hope that he will also consider me. And I, obviously, all I want is to go home to my partner, who is completely happy to have me home and is not scared at all, because he knows that I know more about Ebola than most people in the U.S. And if I were the unlucky person like Dr. Spencer to develop symptoms after returning home, I would be smart and do the right thing and contact the local health department and be safe in going to a facility and being isolated and tested. But this is just an extreme that we have to fight against.
So again, like I said, you have to feel for Kaci Hickox, and I think she made her case pretty well. despite the poor cell phone reception during some of those answers. I think she really put it to New Jersey Governor Christie about taking away her freedom based on fear rather than scientific evidence. You know, one of the things you have to remember, and I think this may be in one of the clips I showed, that the first case of Ebola diagnosed in the United States, Thomas Eric Duncan, he stayed with his family in an apartment after he was sent home from the emergency room when he was sick, and none of them got Ebola. They cleared quarantine. So the people he lived with for a couple days when he was symptomatic in an apartment did not get Ebola. You have to understand the difference between whether something's contagious and whether it's infectious. Ebola is not very contagious. It's very difficult to transmit from one person to another because you have to come in contact with their bodily fluids that has Ebola in it. They have to be symptomatic and you have to come in contact with their bodily fluids. If you come in contact with their bodily fluids, Ebola is very infectious. You're very likely to get the disease, which is why the healthcare workers who are dealing with the vomit and diarrhea of Ebola patients, if they don't have their necks covered and they get a little bit of symptomatic person's vomit or diarrhea on their neck, then there's a good chance that they're going to get Ebola. But just by casual contact, you're not necessarily going to get Ebola. You know, even if you travel on an airplane with someone who is symptomatic, unless you get their bodily fluids on you. Anyway, I don't mean to go on and on about that, but I also wanted to show one of the best arguments I saw about the unintended consequences of these quarantines, about how it's going to disincentivize healthcare workers from going over there. If you're not already convinced from listening to Kaci Hickox, who planned to go to Africa for a month and now may be stuck in this jail tent for 3 weeks. Here you can see also on CNN State of the Union, their chief medical correspondent, I believe is her title, Elizabeth Cohen. I think she made the most succinct argument about how this is going to do more harm than good over in this clip.
I mean, certainly I haven't spoken to a single public health or medical expert who supports this quarantine. They think that it's not worth it, and they think it's actually hurtful, and here's why. So maybe there's a tiny infinitesimal risk that someone who is healthy comes back and all of a sudden starts feeling sick when they're out. Well, they're not going to transmit Ebola the minute they feel ill. The minute they feel ill, they should isolate themselves. They really don't see that there's a risk that anyone like Kaci Hickox could transmit Ebola. But on the other side, they see a huge risk to quarantining people like her. When people see that she's been quarantined, other aid workers who want to go and help, they're not going to go. Many of them I've talked to say there is no way they're going to go. They can't spend a month in Africa and then 3 weeks being quarantined, especially, are they going to get stuck in a tent like she is? Are they going to not be allowed to go home even though they're perfectly healthy? I mean, Kaci related to me that she's staring at the walls. They didn't give her television. The hospital didn't give her reading material or books or anything. And so when you hear that, that certainly discourages you from going to help. And if the Ebola outbreak gets worse in West Africa, then it's going to get worse here. The worse it is there, the worse it is here. We live in a small world.
And, you know, that's the most important point. And you saw reporting there from CNN's Elizabeth Cohen that she's talked to healthcare workers who are saying that if this is the conditions when they come back, they're not going to go. And, you know, I showed clips in the last week or two about how the U.S. military is building all these hospitals and facilities, but what they're missing is healthcare workers to populate them. And that was even in the reporting I showed in the last couple of weeks. We need healthcare workers to go to West Africa to get this Ebola outbreak there that isn't under control. And that's the most important thing, according to, as you saw, like Dr. Anthony Fauci and all the medical experts, according to that last reporter on CNN, that, you know, all the people who are making their decisions based on scientific evidence say that quarantining people who are coming back doesn't make sense and doesn't protect anyone, but is going to make it harder to stop the problem where we really need to stop it, or it is going to affect us more and more over here. You know, if that's all we care about, of course, we should also care about, you know, helping the people in Africa, I think. But the last clip I want to show on Ebola before I get to a couple other quick topics is a Republican from California, Darrell, Issa, who is not normally reasonable, is uncharacteristically reasonable also on this topic, maybe because of the strength of the evidence and all the medical experts. Oh, it's because his committee talked to the medical experts who said that this quarantine actually wouldn't be helpful. But even this, you know, reasonable answer from the usually unreasonable Darrell Issa, you know, he's one of the Benghazi and IRS experts over in amongst the House Republicans, but he even couches his reasonable answer in sort of a conditional, you know, like if the scientists are right and about, you know, the way Ebola is spread. And anyway, I'll talk about that a little more after you see this last clip on the Ebola story for the show tonight over here.
Because I'm not sure you answered the question. The question is we understand why the governors may have done it. Is it a good idea?
The science has told us, if we are to take them at their word, that if somebody does not have an elevated temperature or the other later symptoms, that we can rely on them not being contagious. If that's true, then immediate isolation of people for 21 days is not the answer. Again, trust matters. If we had begun this process by saying, you have to monitor people continuously coming into this country for 10 days, now we think it's 11 or 12, and know whether their temperature rises to know if they were exposed, and we're doing that, then I think the public would have confidence. But in this case, we didn't do that. We had Mr. Duncan come in with elevated temperature. We weren't checking it, and now we're playing catch-up. The important thing is we need to agree that we made mistakes. Government needs to have a plan. And Candy, some of the plans are pretty straightforward. You know, when I was coming in, I looked and I said, you know how many apps are on the iPhone that you can monitor your temperature continuously? We need to ask, how are we going to have everyone coming into this country who may have had contact, how are we going to make it easy, predictable, and verifiable that we're knowing their temperatures for those next X amount of days? If we do that, then we have a monitoring system that can prevent this kind of individual action by the states. If we don't do that, then the American people are asking their governors to protect them.
So
there you can see sort of like a half reasonable answer from Representative Darrell Issa of California, Republican, you know, sort of acknowledging that the scientists are right, that this quarantine actually isn't protecting anyone, but then also worrying about the monitoring. But and that's one of the things that it looks like they may ramp up. Dr. Anthony Fauci talked about that in some of the clips I showed about how there are different levels of risk, and they might start doing more active monitoring where people actually come and check the people in that category. You know, like Kaci Hickox would be able to go home, but there'd be some healthcare worker who would come and actively talk to her once a day, and then she'd check her own temperature another time every day. And you know, I think that the people who are in favor of this quarantine are giving into fear and are, you know, not libertarians, that's for sure. But you can let me know what you think. Those are the clips I want to show on this breaking news story about Ebola. I do have a few clips on politics, but the first couple are about the midterm elections here in the United States that are coming up in less than 2 weeks. It's November 4th, Tuesday, November 4th. And the big question politically, of course, is whether the U.S. Senate is going to remain in control of the Democrats, or if the Republicans are going to pick up the 6 seats they need to take it over. And I decided not to take a bunch of clips about all the polls, just it's within the margin of error. It could basically go either way, although like Nate Silver, who was one of the best pollsters, you know, from 538, if I got that number, and the New York Times, he's still saying it's like over 60% chance that the Republicans are going to take the Senate. But I'm going to show two quick clips. These are both from NBC's Meet the Press, where Chuck Todd had on two senators who are trying to keep the Senate for their respective sides. Chuck Schumer of New York for the Democrats, Rob Portman of Ohio for the Republicans. First, here's the three reasons that New York Senator Chuck Schumer gives that the Democrats are going to hold on to the U.S. Senate on November 4th over in this clip.
I think we will hold the Senate. You know, I know all the pundits are saying Republicans will take the Senate. Democrats are going to prove the pundits wrong on Election Day when we keep the Senate. Three reasons. First and foremost, economic issues predominate. Ebola's in the news, ISIS is in the news, but the average voter, every poll shows far and away, cares most about economic issues. They tend to be for Democrats when economic issues like minimum wage, like equal pay for women, like not sending jobs overseas predominate. Second, we have a much better ground game. You can add 2 to 3 points at minimum.
All of them, huh?
For each of those races, just about every one of those races. So if it's 44, 43, we're probably ahead. And third, as the race gets down to the final moments, the voters focus on the two candidates, not on a national referendum. When the two candidates are compared, almost inevitably we do better. So economic issues, better ground game, better candidates will put us over the top November.
Senator Portman.
So that's like an easy mantra to remember. Economic issues, better ground game, and better candidates is going to keep the Senate for the Democrats. You know, maybe if I keep seeing that over and over again, I might start believing it. But actually, I think especially the ground game, if it works, if the Democrats really do have like a better turnout machine in these close races, that could make a difference. So, but I don't know. Maybe it's wishful thinking on my part. And just to be fair, I want to show Ohio Senator Rob Portman giving the Republican point of view on who's going to have the Senate after the November elections in this clip.
Senator Portman, why is he wrong?
Well,
why do you believe he's wrong?
You know, it's not the pundits who are saying that Republicans are going to get the majority. It's the voters. And your polls show it. Also,
it's tight, though.
Well, it's tight, but the voter intensity is on our side. You were in Iowa, and you saw that with early voting in Iowa, Republicans are winning. That's never happened before. All the polls show that, you know, this is going to be a good year for Republicans. It's a good environment for us. Luke talked earlier about the incompetence that some people feel about the Obama administration. I mean, that's catching up to him. And people are asked, you know, what do you think about the president in your poll today? And you know what they said? He gets less than 40% approval in all those states. And when the president goes on national TV and says, you know what? This is about me. These are my policies. All my policies are on the ballot. And when he further says, and by the way, all these candidates who are trying to distance themselves from me, they all vote with me, and they all want to vote with me. So it is a national election, and Republicans have great candidates. We've got the enthusiasm on our side. And look, people are looking for a change, Chuck. They don't want the status quo, and a change is changing the Senate.
All right, I'll let you both.
So I don't know. I think actually Senator Chuck Schumer made a stronger argument than Senator Rob Portman, although the odds are actually on the side of Senator Rob Portman's argument, despite the wishful thinking I was giving you there. Although, actually, I think there is a good chance that we won't know whether the Democrats or the Republicans have the Senate on November 4th. It may come down to, I've heard in some clips I'm not going to show, that there may be runoffs in Louisiana and Georgia, and so it may not even be till January that we know who won the Senate. That's a possibility. And before I leave the issue of politics, I want to show, I think it's 3 or 4 clips at the end here on presidential politics in 2016, but first on President Obama's legacy and sort of talking about what Senator Rob Portman was saying there about President Obama, not his policies being unpopular. Well, there was this article by Paul Krugman, who has often been a critic of President Obama, but sort of like wrote an article saying why it is he's been underrated and he's actually a very good president. And that came up on HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher, where Bill Maher sort of tried to take this argument to Dr. Cornel West, who's been also a critic of President Obama, and I thought that I agreed with some of what both of them said in that argument that I'll discuss after I show it to you over in this clip.
This for a second, okay, because what you said about Obama was you said he posed as a progressive and turned out to be counterfeit.
Absolutely.
And here is Krugman's.
Absolutely.
He said, well, you know, health care, we didn't get everything we wanted, but there's more cost containment than even the supporters thought.
That's a positive thing.
He said financial reform, didn't get everything we wanted.
Weak.
But Dodd-Frank is real, he said.
Weak.
Okay.
Weak, brother.
Okay, we have Elizabeth Warren's financial consumer.
Yes, but it's not independent or autonomous.
Income inequality still bad.
Out
but,
of control.
But okay, but Obamacare.
Out of control.
But Obamacare goes mostly to the people who don't have a lot of money. It is income distribution, redistribution. The thing that conservatives hate about it, he actually did.
It was a conservative
but he doesn't
policy
get
out of Heritage Foundation, but it is positive. I agree with his impact.
He also mentions that the stimulus worked. We didn't have a depression like Europe did.
Massive unemployment. Most of the jobs are low wage.
But the point is that it's politics is the.
Let's be honest.
Politics is the art of the possible. Let me read his quote. He said, it seems to rest on the belief, you're saying, he said, seems to rest on the belief that if only Obama had put his eloquence behind a radical economic agenda, he could somehow have gotten that agenda past all the political barriers.
That's where he's wrong.
That have constrained even his much more modest efforts.
Wrong, Brother Bill. Obama chose Geithner and Summers out of Wall Street. He chose the drones to drop bombs on innocent people. He chose national surveillance that's going to push Brother James Ryan into jail. That's choices he makes. That's not eloquence at all.
So, yeah, like I said, I kind of agree with both sides of that argument, I hate to say, because the achievements or the not fully understood or fully appreciated achievements of President Obama that Paul Krugman listed and quoted by Bill Maher there, I actually agree with, along with the criticisms that Dr. Cornel West made. And I especially agreed with what Dr. Cornel West said there at the end about how you can't blame limits from Republicans on some of the things. You can't blame Republicans for some of the things that Obama did that are really nasty about U.S. national security, you know, the drone strikes and the NSA spying. And, you know, I didn't show a clip of the James Risen interview on HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher. Hopefully they'll put it up on YouTube, because they've been putting up a lot more clips on the Real Time channel on YouTube, by the way. If you haven't looked at that, I really recommend it, because they're putting up a lot more of the episodes every week. Even if you're not a big fan of Bill Maher, they discuss some things that just don't make it into the other corporate media. You know, like they spent a long time discussing that shooting in that town north of Seattle in the state of Washington. And anyway, so I thought that was an interesting clip to show about whether Obama's legacy has been positive or negative. I kind of agreed with the positives and the negatives that you heard from Bill Maher quoting Paul Krugman, and also Cornel West on, you know, accentuating the negative. And then I have a few quick clips on who may be replacing President Obama on the Republican side. First, over on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, they had their reporter Jonathan Karl interviewing George P. Bush, the son of Jeb Bush, the governor of Florida. And they did sort of a profile of him running for like Texas land commissioner on this big bus with his face on the side of it. And, you know, it starts with this kind of funny clip of some woman saying, I voted for your father or your grandfather, and I voted for your father, so I'm going to vote for you. But of course, this is in Texas, so she means she voted for his grandfather, George H.W. Bush, and then his uncle, George W. Bush. But you can see George P. Bush doesn't mind that she's confused his father with his uncle. And then he kind of makes some news about whether his father, Governor Jeb Bush, former governor of Florida, is going to run for president. And then when he talks about his own presidential ambitions, I think the question that Jonathan Karl asks him kind of reveals more about Jonathan Karl than George P. Bush, as I'll discuss after I show you that whole thing here.
Frail, there are constant reminders that he's in the family business.
I voted for your grandfather. I voted for your father. I'm voting for you.
Excellent. There's the grandfather who was president and the uncle. And listen to what he told us about his father.
So is your dad going to run for president?
I think he's still assessing it.
Do you think it's more than 50%, less than 50%?
I think that it's more than likely that he's giving this a serious thought and moving
More
forward.
than likely that he'll run.
That he'll run. If you had asked me a few years back, I would have said it was less likely.
So the family will be behind him 100%?
The family will be behind him 100% if he decides to do it.
What about George P. himself? You don't grow up in this family without at least thinking about it, do you? You had to at some point think, maybe I'll be president someday.
No, I actually.
I mean, even I've had that thought. I mean, I even had my cabinet picked out, I think, when I was a teenager. So you never once thought about
I thought about
being president?
I thought about service, but I never really understood how it would manifest itself.
I guess we'll have to take his word on that for this week.
So that was a little snarky at the end by Jonathan Karl about, I guess we'll have to take his word on not having thought about being president. And I thought it was a little weird that Jonathan Karl, when he was a teenager, had worked out his whole cabinet as who was going to be his cabinet when he was president. That's kind of more revealing about the reporter than the interview subject, I think. And I guess the breaking news from that, or that's the way they played it on ABC's This Week, was that George P. Bush says it's more than likely that his father, Jeb Bush, former governor of Florida, is going to run for president in 2016. And it seems like there may be an opening there, especially with Christie being knocked down a peg by Bridgegate, although the last couple clips I want to show are from the interview of Governor Christie of New Jersey. First, Chris Wallace of Fox News Sunday gave Governor Christie this chance to clean up a quote he recently made. Some of my friends on the left have said this is sort of his 47% quote, like, Mitt Romney gave himself a lot of trouble in the 2012 election, saying that they're, the 47% who are, the undeserving moochers, or I can't remember the exact quote. Well, Christie said he was tired of the minimum wage, and you can see how he tried to clean that up. And I don't know, he had a couple good phrases in there, like, instead of income inequality, he wants to fight opportunity inequality. And I think this answer may at least get him through the Republican primaries. I don't know if it is going to be all that workable for the general election, but anyway, here's how he tried to clean up his tired of the minimum wage comment, which Chris Wallace actually showed video of it over in this clip.
In that Chamber of Commerce speech, you also said, quote, it's time to start offending people. And there's one comment you made that a lot of people are taking offense to. Here it is.
I'm tired of hearing about the minimum wage. I really am. I don't think there's a mother or father sitting around a kitchen table tonight in America who are saying, honey, if our son or daughter could just make a higher minimum wage, my God, all our dreams would be realized.
Governor, while everyone agrees that we need better paying jobs, for people who are making $7.25 an hour, the minimum wage now, they say that getting an increase to $10 an hour would make a big difference in their lives, and that you were being cavalier about it.
Not being cavalier at all, Chris. I'm saying it exactly as I see it. What we need to do in this country is not have a debate over a higher minimum wage. We have to have a debate over creating better paying middle-class jobs in this country. And if that somehow doesn't comport with what people in the political elite want, well, I'm sorry. But I know, talking to families across New Jersey and now across this country, that what they're aspiring to is to have good-paying, middle-class jobs for their children to take, and even higher, so that they can have a stable home life, so that they can have the ability to go away on a vacation if they'd like to, so they can have the ability to save for their children to go to college. That's the kind of future that people in this country want. And the debate we need to be having is how to have a better pro-growth economy that's growing jobs and good-paying jobs. Jobs at places like Motorola Solutions or other kind of places across the country, other great businesses that operate in New Jersey and in other places across the country that create those kind of really great-paying middle-class jobs. That's the debate we should be having. There's not just income inequality in this country, Chris. The bigger problem is opportunity inequality. And that's what mothers and fathers are sitting around kitchen tables talking about, wanting for their children's future. And that's exactly what I was saying at the Chamber of Commerce. And I don't back off from those comments 1 inch.
So not backing off 1 inch, that's like more of the old Chris Christie, the pre-Bridgegate Chris Christie, I guess. And I don't know, there's kind of a ring to not income inequality, it's opportunity inequality. I think, like I said, that especially might be something that works in the Republican primaries, but I don't know. When they were talking about Chris Christie's chances on the panel discussion in the clip I didn't choose, Britt Hume, their like senior analyst or whatever his title is, he said, well, the Bridgegate thing hasn't really hurt him because he was able to answer these probing questions here today on Fox News Sunday. But I'm going to show you the full probing questions they asked him about Bridgegate on Fox News Sunday. Chris Wallace, the supposedly straight news anchor of Fox News Sunday, only asked him, basically the two questions were, so why is it taking so long for them to clear you, and do you think it's because Democrats want to keep you under a cloud? You think I'm joking? Those are really the two questions about Bridgegate that they asked New Jersey Governor Chris Christie on Fox News Sunday this morning, which of course was their exclusive interview, meaning this is the only program he would go on, and they pointed out this is even the first time he's been on any Sunday morning news analysis show this entire year, 2014. And you can tell me, why do you think he chose Fox News Sunday, Chris Wallace, to be the first interview? I don't know if they had any deal beforehand, but like I said, the final clip I'm going to show you is the two questions to Chris Christie on Bridgegate. Why is it taking so long for them to clear you? And do you think it's because the Democrats are trying to keep you under a cloud? Over in this clip.
I don't have to tell you, this is the first time that you've done a Sunday show since Bridgegate, the scandal about the closing of those lanes from Fort Lee, New Jersey, onto the George Washington Bridge, causing a tremendous traffic jam because of the fact that the mayor of Fort Lee refused to support your re-election. There was a report in September last month that 9 months into their investigation, that federal prosecutors had found no evidence that you had prior knowledge of the lane closures, and yet now, more than a month later, 10 months into the investigation, the state and federal investigations continue. Question, why do you think it's taking so long?
You know, Chris, I did this for 7 years of my career before I became governor. I was the United States Attorney for the District of New Jersey. And one thing I learned very clearly is any time that politicians tried to guess what was going on in prosecutors' offices, they were making a big mistake. So I don't speculate about that stuff. All the people of New Jersey know and need to know is that I had absolutely nothing to do with this. And that seems to be the conclusion that some folks are coming to as well. And I know it will be the conclusion ultimately because I know the truth.
Well, you talk about prosecutors. That's the federal case. The state case is being handled by state legislators. Do you think there's an effort by some of the Democrats there to keep you under a cloud?
Of course. Of course. And if you look at what those hearings have been like, they've been hyper-partisan political. But that's okay, Chris. You don't get anywhere about complaining about these things. Fact of the matter is, we took the steps we needed to take when we discovered that something in the administration had gone wrong. And now we move on, and we've continued to govern and gotten things like bail reform done in New Jersey over the last number of months. Got a balanced budget passed again, and did all the things that you expect the government to be doing, working with Democrats who do not want to be hyper-partisan and political. So this is not the kind of stuff that concerns me at all. I keep doing my job and doing my job as chairman of the Republican Governors Association.
I don't want to...
So, did I lie? Were the questions from Fox News to New Jersey Governor Chris Christie there? So why is it taking so long for them to clear you? And the follow-up was, do you think it's because Democrats want to keep you under a cloud? Those were the probing questions from Fox News and Fox News Sunday, supposedly straight news anchor Chris Wallace. You can let me know what you think down in the comments section. And also, I kind of thought Governor Chris Christie sounded like he was running for president in his answer. Those last two clips I showed, you can let me know what you think about that. I think it's pretty clear, even though he was asked that question on Fox News Sunday and said, I'm going to decide, I'm thinking about it, but I'll decide at the beginning of next year. You know, that's when Hillary's deciding, so maybe they'll both be running. I guess we'll see. And like I said, that's the last clip I want to show you. I appreciate those of you, over 100 of you, who watched as a live show. I've been reading your comments along the way. I noticed you're mostly arguing with each other, mostly on topic, although occasionally getting off onto weird tangents. But I hope I spark some good discussions down there in the comment section. And for those of you who are watching as a recorded show, you can, like I said, use the time indexes to click through to the topics that most interest you. I'm also going to keep the ads in the video only every half hour again this week, because I have been getting at least a few of the donations. If you want to give me a donation to the Liberal Viewer page, you can, right up here there should be, if you click on a little eye that's up in the corner there, you should be able to give a donation to my channel to support my work, or you can do it over on the youtube.com/liberalviewer page. There's a little area where you can click on support Liberal Viewer. That really helps me make these videos without having to put the ads in every 15 minutes. And if I get enough, I'll even just put one ad at the beginning. We'll have to see if they ever get to the point where it will replace that ad revenue. I hope it will, and I hope you'll be joining me every Sunday, 6:30 p.m. Pacific time, for another episode of Liberal Viewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. I hope you enjoyed the clips I picked out for you, and it helped you end your weekend or start your week a little bit more informed about what the corporate media here in the United States thinks is important for you to know about. And hope you enjoyed the commentary and the political comedy, and I guess I'll be seeing you all around the internet.